Hi, welcome back. This book is my own book. Some of you may have seen it already. I have talked about it on other podcasts. It's on my website. I published this towards the end of 2020. It's about the great pandemic, how artists have been affected by cancel culture, the assault on the truth, the assault on women's rights. But this video is not about this book. This video is about my 40 years in science fiction fantasy illustration, which led up to me publishing my own book. So you're not going to see that book until the end of part 3. Part 1 is all about the 1980s. And the 1980s were an exciting time for anybody who was growing up then, who was interested in science fiction. I'm going to hold out a book which some of you may have heard of. It's Rosemary Pardo's very famous Ghosts and Scholars, which famous in the niche world of fantasy, British fantasy, which started life as a little magazine which I was a contributing artist to, and obviously then they invited me to contribute to this, which I was very pleased to do, and you'll see more about this book in this first video. Part 2 is going to be covering the 90s to the 2000s, and part 3 from 2015 when I joined the Morning Star, to bring it up to date. I hope you'll find this little series interesting. This is not about, oh look at me, what a great artist I am. This is actually a homage to all the authors, poets, writers, editors and publishers in the British small press who gave me the opportunity to showcase my work. Without those people, an artist has no platform. Obviously we're now in the cancel culture era where it's difficult for artists to find a platform, so I think this little tour through the history of how I got involved in illustrating, I hope some of you will find it useful. So, good morning. It's a nice sunny winter day here in Bristol in England, and I'm going through the slides of part 1 of my little series, the 1980s. Here's a photo of some of the books. I don't even have copies of some of the small magazines and things that I contributed to in those days. And I can't possibly show you all the illustrations. There were hundreds and hundreds. So I'm trying to concentrate on the ones where I did drawings for front covers, or what I consider to be important publications that I contributed to. So everything you can see there, except for Ghosts and Scholars, is one of my illustrations. Ghosts and Scholars, there's an internal illustration which I will show you in a bit. yeah, this is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a homage to the authors, the editors, and the publishers in the British small press who used my work over 4 decades, 40 years. Um, so let's go on to the next slide. Apologies if you hear any traffic noise or any clicking, but you know, this is just done in my living room. So here we are, the beginning, the very first magazine I was ever involved with. Uh, I was a science fiction artist even as a teenager. I was fascinated by science fiction and fantasy. My mother bought me The Lord of the Rings when I was 8. It took me three weeks to read it. And I discussed all kinds of science fiction books with her. We also watched it on telly, of course. Star Trek, Doctor Who, Time Tunnel, Blake Seven. So yeah, this is where it all started. Early 1980s, a tiny circulation science fiction club magazine, Fisheye. Fisheye was based in Leicestershire. The guiding light behind it was Steve Bowkett, who I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. And I used to go pottering up to Leicestershire on the weekends in my little 125 motorbike from Bristol in the middle of winter sometimes. And I'd meet up with these amazing people, writers and other artists. We'd go to pubs, we'd hold meetings talking about science fiction, we'd meet authors, went to conventions. And this was way before the internet or even mobile phones. This was the days of the British small press. British small press was a lot more free and easy than the way you get published these days, where you have to crawl on your hands and knees really to to editors and compete against millions of other people who are all putting their stuff out there online. And yeah, it's much harder for artists now, and especially in the cancel culture era. So British Small Press was a network of printers up and down the country who would publish short runs of magazines and fanzines, newsletters or soft paperback books. And I'll just go on to the next slide, which is an illustration from Fisheye. And this is just a scan of the page. This was a story by Arthur C. Clarke called Second Dawn. This is the sort of story I was reading at the time. This is a fantastic story about a planet with which is very much like Earth, with these horse type creatures. They like a cross between a horse and a kangaroo, and they have developed huge brains, but they have very poor kind of manual skills. So they can't change the environment in the way human beings can. They live out in the open, grazing like horses, but they have developed philosophy and mathematics and geometry and all the mental skills. So it's all about them and how their world develops. Fantastic story. When I was drawing in the 80s, I used rotring pens a lot, which are technical drawing pens. I felt comfortable with them because I did technical drawing at school at O level. But they are an absolute piglet to use. I mean, they are expensive to start with, and they take a lot of work. You have to soak the nibs in warm water and all this sort of stuff. But the rotring pen gives this very spiky effect, which you're going to see more of as we go through the slides. So here's the next slide. And here's a shout out to Steve Bouquet, who I'm going to put Steve's links to his current website below this video. He was the driving force behind this club I was involved with. On the left is Time and Tide, with one of my, these are both my illustrations, by the way. That was mid-80s, and on the right is his collection of short stories for teenagers called Catch, which again used my cover illustration, but that was not until 2000. So between these two publications here was at least, what, 15 years or more. Steve is a hugely prolific author of teenage fantasy fiction, and he also does a lot for teachers for creative writing in the classroom, which I've also been involved with him, and I'm still professionally associated with Steve. So a big shout out, and I hope you'll check out what he does on his website. Now going back to the 80s again, here are a couple of my back cover illustrations actually. These magazines were, you know, they were amazing. They gave artists full reign to exercise our imaginations. Now these were, the one on the left is called Bell Chamber Tower, and the one on the right was Nerve Gardens. Both of these little magazines are probably well remembered by anybody who's involved in British fantasy writing, and they were basically run by a guy called Mark Valentine. Mark is another prolific author in the field of supernatural fiction and book collecting, and again he's got a website. He's still very active. I will put his website down below. Let's go on. This one and the next one are two illustrations from Bell Chamber Tower. This one is to a story called St. Michael and All Angels. Now, St. Michael and All Angels is a very common name for churches in Britain, and St. Michael was the dragon-slaying archangel, and churches of St. Michael tend to be built on top of hills, which are very often old prehistoric sites. So obviously my picture shows probably a medieval workman on a scaffold seeing the dragon flying by. And here's another illustration from Bell Chamber Tower. This was a story about hallucinogenic plants which grew on a sort of pagan site, and people had visions there of long dead warriors. So quite a spooky picture. And again you can see the spiky effect of the rotring pens. Going on to the next one. This is just in between the previous two. This is another shout out to a guy called Roger Johnson. He was heavily involved in these little magazines. This is one of my covers I did for him. And again, Roger is well known in the British fantasy scene. Back to Nerve Gardens. This was the back cover that you saw before, and this was an illustration, a June illustration, kind of Aubrey Beardsley kind of style, and this was my drawing of Liet Kynes, who was abandoned in the desert, so he's walking out in the desert to die. The editor put the little Celtic border around it, which looks very nice. I probably wouldn't even have had the skill to do that back in those days. It was all done with cut and paste and Xeroxing. And just one more. Again from Nerve Gardens. This is obviously an Adam and Eve with a science fiction twist. I'm not trying to show you everything. I did hundreds of illustrations in the British small press. And like I say, I don't even possess most of them anymore. So this is a little tour through some of my outlets. So at this time, there wasn't an email. So the only way to send your artwork was through the post. And very often you never got the artwork back. There were hardly any copying facilities. In Bristol, I remember there was one Xerox shop which was over the road from the City Council offices and served the City Council, did all their copying for them. It was mostly black and white. In order to get a colour copy of your artwork to send to a publisher, Xerox had to send your original away to London, to their London shop, and then it was then sent back all through the mail. So publicising your work was hard. It was very much by word of mouth, by phone, and by being involved in the small press network. So this is the reason that I really didn't manage to make my hobby into an actual paid career, because for the whole time I was doing this, I also had to earn a living, and I was working full-time in the construction industry. So let's go on to the next one. Again, this is Nerve Gardens, and this is the inside of a cover showing a spread with 2 of my drawings. And if you zoom in on it, you appear there, you can see some of the names. Mark Valentine again, another writer there, Marise Morland, she's still writing science fiction novels, and Andrew Darlington again, and in fact the story that's named here was, I think, the first one he ever published. And again, I'll put these people's websites below the video. And there are going to be many other authors in the pages of these magazines who have gone on to make careers for themselves in fantasy and science fiction. Right, now on to one of my very favourite collaborations. K.V. Bailey, Kenneth Vi Bailey, a very respected science fiction critic and poet. Before he retired to Alderney, which was his home, he had been quite high up in the BBC as their chief education officer. Some of my best ever illustrations are in this book, Distant Music. I also did the cover for another one of his called The Sky Giants. His poetry was very science fiction, fantasy inspired. This cover is probably my favourite one I've ever done in my life. I interpreted Distant Music as a sort of distant future of the earth, and these 3 creatures are sat on a seashore, obviously playing music, which is being made from the skeletons of dead creatures that have washed up, and they are descended from primates, amphibians and rodents. So just one of my favourites, and again with rotring pen. One of the drawings that's in this book is the cover of the next magazine I'm showing you, which is Foundation number 44, the review of science fiction. And this is still going strong. The name's slightly changed. I'm very proud of this edition. It was an interesting edition, actually. It had a real life story in it about the science fiction writer James Triptree Jr., who was actually a woman called Alice Sheldon. She was one of the many female science fiction writers who had to use male names in order to get published in this very male-dominated field. Foundation obviously features many well-known authors. In this one, Ian Watson was the features editor. And I was told on the grapevine at the time that somebody recommended this cover illustration for a Hugo, which was the Science Fiction Annual Awards. I don't think it even made the shortlist, but just being recommended for a Hugo was a massive boost to my ego at the time, and one of the things I'm very proud of. We're almost at the end of the 1980s. And another collaboration I was very proud of is Ghosts and Scholars. It started off as a small magazine, and I was one of the regular artists. So when they put this book together, 1987, they invited me to contribute. You can see from this illustration the spikiness of the fine detail, which is from the rotring pens. Rosemary Pardo is a legend in the field of supernatural writing. It's all very M.R. James inspired. I will link again to a page on her website which is about the history of this particular magazine, Ghosts and Scholars. And if you look at her website, she mentions many of the authors that were involved in these small press publications, such as Mark Valentine and Roger Johnson, who I've already mentioned. For most of my career as an artist, this book remains the only real book I was ever published in, right up to the last 2 or 3 years. The rest was all small press publications. I don't know whether it's in my personality, but I was always attracted to the more indie, the more underground, the more, the tiny circulation things that have ended up, some of them being quite culty, quite to collectors in this field. It was only ever an occasional paid hobby to me. I worked full time, 6 or 7 days a week sometimes. Artists in this small press were very, very rarely paid. In the case of this particular book, I think I received £50 and a copy of the book, which was really generous at the time. So in part 2, we're going to go into the 90s, look at some magazines rather than books that I've illustrated, and going forward to the 2000s. And then in part 3, I'll bring you up to date on the last few years and what I'm doing today. So thanks for watching, and I hope you'll see me in the next one.